everybody. Good morning. Thanks for coming out so early. My name is Beth Weinstein, and I direct our subscriber events program. I am so happy that all of you are here. How many of you are subscribers? Oh, that's so exciting. And how many of you have been to an event before, a subscriber event? Oh, great. So we have heard from our subscribers that you want access to our journalists. You want the stories behind the stories, to understand how some of our projects and columns and stories are put together. So the kinds of events that we do really give you a window into the newsroom. They really create a space where you can have a dialogue with our journalists and talk about the things that didn't make it onto the page. The kinds of events that we've presented in the recent weeks are an Opinion Live event with Lindy West, Caitlin Greenidge, Maeve Higgins, and others. We did a still processing event with Jenna Wortham, Wesley Morris, and Samin Nasrat. We did a conversation with female marathoners the day after the New York Marathon with 3 of the marathoners who were in the top 10. Des Linden, who won the Boston Marathon last year, participated, and they talked about competition, stereotypes about female athletes, and the female body. We have a ping pong event coming up with Will Shorts at his Table Tennis Center, and it is just a short Metro North ride away, so I hope you'll come. This morning's event is emblematic of the types of programming that we present. The 10 best books of 2018 is publishing at 10 o'clock. This list has been embargoed, so you are the very first people outside of 620 that will have seen the list, heard about it, so this is super special for us. This event is also a live taping of our Books podcast. I'm really excited right now to introduce you to Pamela Paul. She's the editor of the New York Times Book Review, and she oversees books coverage at the Times. She is also the host of our weekly podcast, Inside the New York Times Book Review. I hope you'll all listen moving forward. Her most recent book, her 5th book, is My Life with Bob. And I'm excited to introduce them, and I hope I'll see you again.
Good morning. So this is the Book Review Podcast. I'm Pamela Paul, and this is our first time announcing our 10 best books of the year live in front of an audience, as well as to our listeners worldwide. Before we start to announce the books and talk about them, I want to introduce my panel here of fellow podcasters. Many of them will be familiar to those of you who listen regularly to the Book Review Podcast, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them. We have John Williams, who is an editor at the Books on the Books desk. He edits all of our daily critics. He is also a writer for the Times. He writes the 5 Qs column and many other things. And he is known for his great website of yore, The Second Pass. John, thanks for being here. Lauren Christensen is what we call a preview editor at the Book Review, one of a full staff, some of whom are here, but not all. Lauren joined us after stints at Vanity Fair and Harper's Bazaar, and she also has a master's from Oxford in Victorian literature. Greg Cowles is our senior editor for books. He is also our poetry editor and a longtime veteran of the Book Review. Tina Jordan joined us recently after 28 years as the book's headmistress of Entertainment Weekly magazine. Emily Aiken, also new to the Book Review. She is another preview editor on our staff after previous stints as a reporter for the erstwhile Saturday Ideas section of the New York Times and at the New Yorker, an editor there. And Gal Beckerman is the author of When They Come for Us Will Be Gone, the epic struggle to save Soviet Jewry. He is a former opinion editor of The Forward, and he is now a preview editor at the Book Review. So welcome, guys. We are going to announce painfully, one by one, our winners, beginning with fiction. And I am going to start with a third novel, The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. Greg, you want to tell us about it?
Sure. The Great Believers is an old-fashioned kind of sweeping social novel. It is set in 2 different time periods. One is the mid-'80s in Chicago, where it tells the story of the early days of the AIDS crisis there. And it follows a group of gay men in Chicago really at the cusp of big social change for gay men in general as a marginalized population dealing with this great crisis. And then the second part is set in basically present-day Paris, where one of the characters from the Chicago section, a woman who ends up taking care of a lot of those men, is now searching down her estranged daughter, who's been involved in a religious cult and has now moved to Paris. So that's it's a great book. It's written in kind of a sterling, almost journalistic, very clear prose, and it's very ambitious and almost flawless in what it pulls off.
And that, I think, points to what we mean by best books. So best books is a book that is not only of the moment, but a book that we think transcends the moment. When we choose these books and we agonize over this process, it takes us months. We actually begin at the very beginning of the calendar year. We're looking for books that combine not only excellent prose, strength of writing, but great storytelling, the force of the narrative, books that we think will really stand the test of time, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. And it was a pleasure to choose The Great Believers because it's a third novel. Now we know first novels are often recognized. Second novels now are with an official prize for them. But third novels, it's very nice to see people get recognized mid-career. And our next book on the list is another third novel. It's Washington Black by Essie Adugin. And Emily is going to talk a little bit about that book.
Yes. So Washington Black is a work of historical fiction. It's set in the 1830s, primarily on our side of the globe. It opens in Barbados on a slave plantation. But despite that fact, it is not primarily a book about slavery. It's really an adventure story, and it's narrated by a young boy he begins his life as a field hand on this plantation, but his life is utterly transformed. Within 50 pages, he's literally levitated out of slavery in a hot air balloon. And the novel takes off from there, and it goes to extraordinary places. It goes to the Arctic, it goes underwater, there's deep sea diving, all of which has been meticulously researched by Essie Adugin, and is just within the realms of possibility. So a rather implausible, but historically possible tale that's written in a supple, subtle, deeply nuanced prose. It's a tremendous work of imagination.
Those of you may have seen that Essie Adugin's novel recently won the Giller Prize in Canada for their best novel. And I should say that we picked these books actually almost 2 months ago. And we sit tight as we watch the sort of fall literary prize season go by and see what else, what other recognition the novels get before they are recognized by us as one of our 10 best. The next novel is The Perfect Nanny. This is an unusual book in certain ways for us as a best book because it was released early in the year. So we do still look at books early in the year. It's one of 3 books on our fiction best list that is, but this one isn't quite a debut novel, but it was a debut as translated in the United States. So Leila Slimani's first novel, Adele, will be out in January in the US, but that was her first novel that she wrote, but this is the first one translated here. And it also came out not only early in the year in the US, but it also was published as a paperback original, which means that it didn't have a hardcover release, and sometimes those books don't get quite as much attention. But this one really knocked us out from the beginning. Leila Slimani herself is a really interesting figure. She was considered to be the Minister of Culture in France. She's of North African descent. I think she is an immigrant, French Moroccan. And Lauren, tell us more about it.
I love this book so much. I think, when I first you're looking at the cover. When I first saw it, it strikes you as this sort of commercial thriller. You don't see the head of the nanny, and I just kind of, you assume a lot of things from just the cover. And when you open it up, it just shocked me with the sort of psychological heft of it. It really dives deep into this story. It was based on a true story of a Brooklyn mother, I believe.
It was a Manhattan mother on the Upper West Side. Many of you probably remember this case where a mother...
It was just litigated.
Yes.
So a mother hired a nanny who ended up murdering the children. I'm not giving away any spoilers. It's in the first sentence of this book. And so it was based on that story. And it sort of inverts the thriller structure because it starts with the climax, right? I mean, you know from the beginning that the nanny has killed the kids, and then somehow it gets even more dramatic from there, and I just thought that was such a brilliant construction. I also think that there's so much more than just the kind of emotional urgency of it. It's also it asks really hard questions that I think are so universal, even if you haven't experienced something as horrific as this, which are, what if a mother decides that she actually wants to continue having a life at the expense of spending some time with her young children? What are at stakes in the relationship between, the mother and the person she trusts to, with the lives of her kids? And sort of other, outer world concerns of race and class that play into those really personal issues as well. So there's just so much to unpack in it, and it's a lot more than sort of just a cheap paperback.
It
was
won
also
the Prix Goncourt.
Yes, it won the Prix Goncourt, which is France's top literary prize. And in French, it's interesting that it was published in a very different way. The title was Chanson douce, which is
Lullaby.
Lullaby,
Yes.
yeah.
And in England, it had a different title in London too. It wasn't as commercial a title. I
Yeah.
can't remember.
It's
Emily,
also a real portrait of mental illness. I mean, which is what I found fascinating, having been really struck by that news story here in New York. You want to understand how somebody could have kind of come to do something like this, and it's such a hard task for a novelist to set herself to actually kind of reverse engineer that, which is what the book does.
And I think what's fascinating, too, is she doesn't completely answer that question. I mean, we know this woman has snapped, and there are all sorts of clues about her. She's lonely, she's in debt, and there are hints of her capacity for violence. There's an incredible scene that I hope I'm not going to give away too much, involving a rotten chicken whose carcass is left for the parents to find, sort of stripped of every bit of its meat. After the mother has thrown away this rotten chicken, the nanny fetches it out of the trash. But that answer, why do people snap and commit these, a kind of senseless acts of violence, is never completely resolved, to the novel's credit, I think.
When Soleimani came over to the States after the book came out to do some events here, I talked to her about this, and she was surprised by the fact that American readers were very interested in sort of knowing what her verdict was on the characters and sort of clear-cut answers. And she said that she thought it was so interesting that Americans, now we're going to get into gross generalizations, which always have exceptions, but that we all wanted sort of a very clean answer, much more black and white, and that she felt that in other countries, not just France, but that there was a little bit more comfort with that kind of ambiguity. And I think it was dealing with those nuances that was something that really stood out for us when we were picking this book. All right. Now we get to the two real debuts on our list. I will talk about, next we'll talk about Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday. John, you want to talk about that?
Sure. I think that this is just anecdotally, I think this was, to people I've spoken with, this was the most widely admired novel of the year. It also came out very early in the year, so we had to keep it in mind as we went. It's the story, it's kind of a triptych. The first part of the book is about a young woman named Alice, who's a 20-something publishing assistant who aspires to be a writer, and she meets in the park one day a writer about 40 years older than her named Ezra Blazer, and they embark on an affair, a very affectionate, tender affair in which he, tells her about writing. She sort of takes care of his needs as he gets older. She brings him his Mylanta, and they watch baseball in bed together. And it's patterned after, as one of our reviews said, there's an unabashed resemblance to Philip Roth and Ezra Blazer, and that's because Halliday has said that she had a brief romantic relationship with Roth. And the middle of the book completely departs. It's a first-person story told by an Iraqi American who's been detained at Heathrow Airport on his way to visit his brother in Kurdistan. And it is essentially a first-person story about him and his family, the ways in which they suffer in the world, and a lot of big political issues. And then in the third section, it's a transcript of a radio interview that the Philip Roth character gives, in which he talks about his craft and the craft of writing fiction. There are a lot of things that I really admire about this book. One is that there are about 500 ways that first section could go wrong, writing about a May-December romance with someone like Philip Roth. It's incredibly subtle. It's very funny. Their dialogue is very naturalistic. It's not pretentious. She conveys a lot with a little. And the pieces don't fit together explicitly. And I think for the very small minority of readers I know who didn't greatly enjoy this book, it was because they thought, well, why are these three things all in the same book? And she leaves it up to you, I think, to connect those dots a little bit. I really care much more about the writing than the narrative structure of most books. So that it just won me over completely on the level of the prose.
It's interesting. That's one of those books that surprised us as editors at the Book Review, because we were all aware of this book. The author won a Whiting Award, and we all knew it was coming, and we all knew that it was coming as sort of the book by the woman who had an affair with Philip Roth, and therefore our expectations were sort of on the low end. But it won over many fans at the Book Review. Greg, you were also a fan of.
I really loved this book, and I did care about the structure a little bit, and I thought that the first part, the Philip Roth part, was much more successful as fiction, as kind of entering the dream, than the second part was. But I also thought that played into this idea of asymmetry, and it's an idea that she plays with throughout the book. There's personal asymmetry. He's the established writer, and she's the aspiring writer. And then there's political asymmetry with America and the wars in the Middle East. And then there's this asymmetry itself in the book. So she's kind of enacting the stuff that she's writing about. And I was very impressed with how she pulled that off.
Yeah, no, me too.
Yeah.
All right, our final debut.
I wanted
Tina.
to throw something in, which was that, so it was the subject of a huge auction. Like, everybody in town wanted to buy this novel when it went on the block because her reputation was so fabulous. And it's interesting for us as editors because we watch those auctions happen, and then 6 months or a year later when we get the galley, often we're disappointed, right? I mean, but here was a case where it lived up and more. Like, it was so great to
see that a book this good got the attention that it deserved.
Yeah, that everybody realized it at the outset, and that when it was finally in our hands, we're like,
And even though you have the kind of Philip Roth bit in the back of your head as you're reading, it really transcends that, I think.
Can I jump in just one more point?
I told you it was widely
just
admired.
To say, the three sections of the book are very different and are not explicitly connected, but one of the pleasures, if you enjoy the sort of really close reading and thinking at sort of the meta level, she drops in little clues about how these pieces connect, so that the young woman who's having the affair with Philip Roth wants to be a writer, and she's very anxious about whether she has the kind of moral vision, the ability to write a novel about the important things. And she sort of tells Ezra Blazer, but what about world affairs and politics, and aren't those the important things? What do I have to say? And of course, the second half of the novel is about someone who is literally in the throes of global geopolitics. He's stuck in Heathrow due to a war happening in his home country of Iraq. And the third section as well, interspersed in this sort of light-hearted radio interview, Ezra Blazer drops little comments about the novel and how sometimes you have to let characters just do what they're going to do, and they may just pass each other and not interact. Anyway, so it's really fun to kind of connect those threads. It's just, this is a brilliantly constructed
There's
novel.
something almost musical about the construction of it.
Absolutely. I think that's
the little
true.
echoes back and forth.
All right, our final on the fiction list is There by Tommy Orange. Tina, you want to tell us about that?
yes. On a very simple, like, one sentence level, this novel is about a group of Native Americans who are all traveling to a big powwow at the Oakland Coliseum. And it actually opens with this remarkable nonfiction essay. Orange is of Cheyenne and Arapaho descent, and he's making the case in this really, searing, white-hot prologue that all the ideas that, the stereotypes that most Americans have about indigenous peoples, about Native Americans, are wrong. And he's talking about how, in fact, that they live in cities. And he says, I had to write this line down because it was so beautiful. It said, we know the sound of the freeway better than we do rivers, the howl of distant trains better than wolf howls. We know the smell of gas and freshly wet concrete better than we do the smell of cedar and sage. Anyway, I've had people just read that intro who haven't had time, to sit down and read the whole book. I know, Gal, you were also a huge fan, right?
Yeah, no, and then the book moves on,
Right.
and it's kind of this kind of polyvocal portrait of Native Americans living in Oakland.
Short chapters from
Short
different points
chapters,
of view,
right? And again, we talked about like kind of what we mark, as a best book, and often it's a book that like you see the difficulty level is high. For me, a book that tries to kind of tell the story of a community, I'm like, oh, okay, let's see what happens here, and that's really what he was trying to do. But I think he really pulled it off. You move from chapter to chapter, and you really feel the individuals behind each of these voices, and he's doing a lot of kind of fictional pyrotechnic type things that also can go really wrong, moving from third person to first person, then back to third person. I think he does it one chapter in second person, but I thought it worked really well as giving kind of a sense of how these characters are trying to kind of pull out the strand of their identity that is still Native American and understand what that means for them in contemporary life.
Right. At the risk of being boring, I'm going to read one more line out loud, which was, one of the chapters is by a man who has a Native American father and a white mother, and he's describing how hard it is to coexist, sort of half in those worlds. And he says, you were white, you were brown, you were red, you were dark, you were both, and you were neither. It's just stunning writing.
There's nothing boring about that.
No.
All right, so drum roll. Our 5 fiction winners, once again, are The Perfect Nanny by Layla Soleimani, Lisa Holliday's Asymmetry, There by Tommy Orange, Washington Black by Essie Adujan, and The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay. And just so you know, the 10 best wasn't always the 10 best. It used to actually just be a random arbitrary number for a long time of which books. It could be 6 books, it could be 12 books. And when Sam Tannenhouse became the editor, he made it into a neat 10. Even then, we sometimes had an uneven number between fiction and nonfiction. I have to say we're often tempted to go back to that because we're so eager to sneak in like just one more fiction or maybe one more nonfiction. And so at the end of this, our conversation about our actual 10 best, we'll talk about some of the books that almost made it, or that some of us were deep partisans of and wanted very much. So we wanted to honor those books as well. But before we get into the sort of personal runners-ups, the nonfiction winners, let's start with our first book, which is Shane Bowers' American Prison, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment. Emily, you want to start?
Sure. So American Prison is really a remarkable feat of investigative reporting. Shane Bauer is a name many of you might know. He probably first came to public attention when he was arrested with 2 friends for trespassing into Iranian soil and spent 2 years in an Iranian jail. And upon returning to the United States after he was released, he, as a reporter for Mother Jones, hired himself to work as a corrections officer in a private prison. He decided to go undercover, sort of, although he worked under his own name. He wanted to learn about the private prison industry in this country, which is substantial. Something like 8% of American inmates are held in prisons that are privately run. And he was hired, as I say, with very little due diligence. They didn't figure out he was a reporter, and he went undercover, armed with all sorts of equipment to sort of record and photograph his experience there. And his stint lasted 4 months before he was sort of caught. His identity was revealed. But that was plenty. He was working at a private prison in rural Louisiana, and what he saw was shocking.
Very little training going in also.
Right. Extremely poor training, very low morale, very low pay, medical negligence, just violence, incompetence. Bloodhounds were used on inmates. There was a suicide that he was present at the prison when it happened. And all of this he wrote up initially in an article for Mother Jones that won a National Magazine Award, and he's expanded that article into a book and added some of the most disturbing details, actually, the historical research that he did for the book, where he uncovers the model for the private prison industry dates to the South after the Civil War, when majority black inmates were sort of farmed out to plantations to pick cotton in a form of slave labor. This was a practice known as convict leasing. And this allowed the South to remain competitive with the industrial North North. Basically, they had a kind of captive workforce. I think the biggest cotton mill in Texas at one point was in a prison in Texas. So it's a very disturbing expose, very powerful reporting.
I mean, one of the achievements of this book is something that's hard to pull off, which is so many books begin as articles, as magazine articles or newspaper stories, and don't ever really transcend that kind of form. You sort of feel like you're getting an expanded article, or it should have stayed in that format. And I think this is an example of a book that really manages to make a case for the book itself and to really offer more context and depth so that it stands on its own.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I found this book so searing and so shocking. I actually went back to a book that was a huge hit 25 years ago called New Jack. Do you remember that?
Yes,
About someone trained
that
to
was the
work
Ted
at Sing
Conover.
Sing, the Ted Conover. He was well compensated. He was well trained. I mean, it could not have been
The
more
starker,
opposite.
the differences.
Right.
between-
Yeah.
He did not work at a private prison.
No,
Ted
he
Conover.
didn't. But I mean, just it was.
The Shane Bauer 2 is a book that fans of Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing might turn to for background, because there's a lot of the that's also Louisiana
point.
prison, and it gives kind of the nonfiction version of the prison stuff in her story.
One of the hardest things about choosing our 5 best nonfiction is that there's so many different kinds of books to cover, from investigative reporting to finance and economics to science to memoir. It's to history and biography. It's just so many different options. It's very, very tough to narrow down. And the next book on our list, I think, is one that occupies several categories. It's the Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. And this book, you could say, is a science book, but it's also a history of the psychedelics in this country and the culture around it. And it's also really a book about the brain. And I think, frankly, just a book about what it means to be human. This was a book that the publisher actually held a lunch for the media, as they occasionally do. And at this media lunch, which was filled with reporters and jaded media types and editors at book reviews like ours, everyone was sort of transfixed and just listened as Michael Pollan told a story about how, in order to report this book on psychedelics, he felt to take psychedelics himself, and he had not ever taken LSD. He ended up, I think, trying 4 or 5 different psychedelics himself. And at the end of the conversation, the first question that someone asked was, can you tell us a little bit more about the underground networks through which you obtained these drugs? And it was like they had articulated what everyone else in the room was thinking, and we kept him there, I think, for another hour asking him questions.
They didn't hand it out at the lunch.
questions.
That wasn't part. That wasn't
Yes.
part of the lunch.
And Michael Pollan is no newcomer to nonfiction. He's obviously a huge best-selling writer. He writes for the New York Times Magazine and many other places. And this piece, I think, rose out of a piece for the New Yorker. But we all felt that this book, in a way, and Emily, maybe you could talk about this after too. It's almost as if his writing went to another level after. I'm not going to necessarily attribute it to the drugs, but we all love what he did in books like The Botany of Desire and all of his books on sort of how and why we should eat certain foods. This book, it almost seemed like he was transformed by the writing. And I have to say, as someone who came to this book with a completely closed mind about psychedelics, and for the record, I've not ever taken acid, I walked away feeling almost evangelical, as other editors on this on the stage here know well.
I think what's like for me the most interesting part of the book is when he gets into this kind of spiritual notion of what psychedelics actually do, which is they strips away kind of the ego part of our brains and allows us to reconnect with a kind of a childlike, approach to the world. And he's trying to understand kind of what that means for how we can be happier, and live as kind of conscious people.
Yeah, I don't know about the writing being transformed, but I think he was somewhat transformed, and says that in the book. I mean, he admits early on in the book that he's a very square guy, and he's very convincing about that. And he says that he's not a very spiritual guy, that he doesn't do a lot of self-reflection. And what he and a lot of other people in the book who he talks to who have taken LSD really talk about is the way in which after the trip. It's not really like the grooviness of looking at all the colors and this and that, but they want to almost maintain this sense of perspective that they got while they were gone.
Right.
And they want to apply it to it's almost like therapy. And his big argument in the book, it is a lot of everything, science, memoir, history. But if there's an argument to it, it's that he's saying that science is only now kind of getting back to the job of trying to rescue the use of LSD as a possible therapeutic practice and to get it back from what he calls the countercultural baggage. Because what happened is Timothy Leary and everyone in the 60s, it just got associated with this zany sort of escapist culture. And he's saying that even back then, scientists were starting to think about how it might help people.
And there's a lot that's convincing about how it helps PTSD and people who are, having terminal illness at the end of their lives. And
And one of the things I loved about it is so much more than just science and medicine. I mean, it goes back way before Ken Kesey. I mean, your hero William James figures really prominently in this. I mean, Aldous Huxley, and so there's literary implications, and Steve Jobs took it. I mean, so there's it's really big in the tech community, and just sort of how the dissolution of the ego pervades just sort of medical questions, and it was just a.
All right, speaking of Steve Jobs, our third book is Lisa Brennen Jobs' memoir, Small Fry. This was a book, again, that I think took us all by surprise. We all knew it was coming, and we knew it was coming with the line that I think most people thought about this book as the memoir by Steve Jobs' daughter. And I think that all of us found that it was so much more than that. Tina, you want to tell us about reading Small Fry?
I do, and my favorite line, again, I'm sorry to do this, will sort of encapsulate it. She says of her father, for him, I was the blot on a spectacular ascent. And, at the beginning of the book, she's his oldest child, by the way. Her mother is suing for child support, and because he's denied paternity. He's forced to take a paternity test. It's proven that he's the father. Her mother wins $500 a month in support. Meanwhile, Apple is about to go. Am I getting this language right? Go public, Emily? Yes. And the day after the agreement, and he knew this was coming, he was worth $220 million all of a sudden.
Book people know nothing about money.
Yeah.
I was going to say with Apple, I don't think it was go public, it was go interstellar. I think that was the.
So interesting. Anyway, so her story, and it's her story. It's not her father's story. I think a lot of people have come to this book thinking that it's going to be more about Steve Jobs. It's not. It's about the neglect and abuse, indeed, that she suffered at the hands of her father. But more than that, it's a book about how our parents shape us.
Yes, I guess I think we were all struck by the prose. And I will say there was a lot of skepticism, not just in the office, but among even potential reviewers who said, oh, this had to be ghost written.
She is Mona Simpson's niece.
Right. or score settling.
And I know Lisa herself has said, I believe on our podcast, that this was not the book she wanted to write as a first book. She really did not want to write the story of her life and her father. Anything but that, she said. Something like to that effect.
She said it's the book I needed to write to get it out of the way, which I thought was such a beautiful description for why
she
someone
couldn't
writes.
avoid writing this book.
Yeah.
And I think that when you read it, you will see how vindicated she is. She really is a writer. This is a book that works on the kind of accretion of granular detail. It's an assembly of vignettes and scenes that are painted with just such vivid and subtle detail that it's extraordinary. I'm thinking of one scene. She's driving with her mother through the rain, and her mother's really losing it. Her mother is an impoverished single parent and a struggling artist in a beat-up car. One of the windshield wipers doesn't work very well. There's a pit where a stone has hit the windshield, and Lisa's taking all of this in the front seat next to her mother. Her mother begins to wail and scream and beat her fists on the steering wheel in the driving rain. And Lisa is 4. And I think she discussed this scene on our podcast, and she says she remembers it vividly. And she was 4. You're with her. You believe her. The accretion of detail is just extraordinary.
I want to hear a little more from Lauren, because I think she's the one who joked at one point during this process in the office. She said, "Can all 5 nonfiction books be small fry?"
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to what Pamela was saying about, and Gall too, about sort of the criteria that goes into this, this decision, which is, the merit and the difficulty of the task that they set out for, these authors set out for themselves. And I think, we all have read and seen and just heard about this ultra narrative of Steve Jobs. This is not a person, we don't come into the book without preconceptions. And for this debut, very young author to come in and sort of topple, I think, this narrative by heavyweights like Walter Isaacson and was it Sorkin who did the movie? I mean, these big names who are telling this story and feeding us this story of Steve Jobs, and no one doubts his genius and his contribution to contemporary life. But there's another narrative that's really important, and if you want to get the story of the whole person, I think that it really meaningfully informs sort of history and just your understanding of human interaction, and it was a stunner to me.
And Lauren, you also made the point that it's as much about her mother and about the
Absolutely.
relationship between mother and
It's
daughter.
a mother-daughter story as well.
All right. Our next nonfiction winner is another memoir, another debut. This was one that we agreed on, I think, very early on. There was a lot of consensus around Tara Westover's Educated. John, you want to start a little bit on that book?
Yeah, I'll start. This is just one of those books where the story itself is so incredible that she's a great writer, and she's also really good at granular detail and scenes, like Emily was saying about Lisa Brennan Jobs. But just this story, and I'll let others fill in more of the details, of going basically from living with a separatist father who believes that society is poisonous, and being raised in this almost medieval way, and being illiterate for a very long time, and then eventually becoming, I forgot where she got her PhD from, but she's from Cambridge. Is just the outline of it. Even if this was only passably written, it would be an incredible book to read, but it's better than that.
Yeah, I feel like it's people hearing about this book sometimes are quick to lump it into what I call the misery memoir category, but it's anything but. And she was entirely self-taught. Being homeschooled for their family meant that the mom would send them down in the basement and they would just turn the pages of books. Doing 50 pages of math meant opening the math book and just turning 50 pages. And whatever it was in her that made her want more and made her want to learn and to educate herself. I mean, this is somebody who never went to high school. She had to study for the college entrance exams on her own.
I felt like her relentless curiosity and sort of pursuit of self-knowledge pervades the book itself, in that she not only wrote her own story, but then she had a number of siblings, some of whom she's not on good terms with, others whom she is, the reasons become obvious in the telling of the story. But she goes back and asks them about their memories of certain experiences and sort of checks herself against their accounts, which I thought was an interesting and brave thing to do in a memoir.
I would urge people to go back to the original podcast that she appeared on when the book came out, because that was a really great conversation you had with her where she talked about that and a lot of other things that really showed her like the depth and range of her emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is, so having basically educated herself, she's not widely read in memoirs. Do you know how when you sometimes read a memoir, you have the sense that somebody has, been reading from Mary Carr on, but her voice is just so original. This isn't constructed like a regular memoir.
All right, I'm going to, without further ado, go to our last book on the list, which is David W. Blight's Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, a monumental biography that was just recently published. Gall, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So Blight is a Yale professor whose expertise is the abolition movement. And here again, it's a different kind of difficulty level in that Frederick Douglass himself wrote so much about his own life.
3 memoirs.
What was that?
3 autobiographies.
3 autobiographies, like nearly 1,000 pages, I think, about his own life. And so how do you approach the story of Frederick Douglass and bring freshness to it? So Blight had access to archives that weren't really used before, a private collection that he was able to get his hands on. And what he does with that material is really deepen the story in two ways. First, you get the personal life of Frederick Douglass, which is kind of underneath the surface of the memoirs. It doesn't really break through. For example, the story of his lovers, the story of his second wife, a woman who was white. It's kind of an unusual circumstance, in the late 19th century. So you get really a story of his household in Rochester and this kind of strange arrangements and the chaos that surrounded it. And also you get his later life, once he'd also become truly a celebrity in America. And a sense, I think, and this came through in our review of the book, of just his natural charisma, just a man who really was able to kind of claim an audience when he stood in front of people. And I think that it all just comes through in a really kind of magisterial way in this book.
It's also, he's one of those figures that we think we all know
Right.
what we need to know about, in terms of his career as an abolitionist and his speeches and his own writing. And what Blight makes clear by contextualizing it in the history of the time is just how exceptional every step of his life was, from the circumstances of his own slavery, and he really gets into detail that I found fascinating. The fact that when he was a slave in Baltimore, that he lived among free men, which is not our conception of how slaves were housed and how they went about their daily lives, and the circumstances of his escape and the way in which he was able to rise from prominence from absolutely nothing. Almost every step of the way, his life was marked by things that were exceptions to the history of that moment.
And his role, also just the influence that he had over American society at the time, which seems unusual to read about now. To think that Abraham Lincoln called him to the White House to kind of help him deal with issues surrounding the Civil War. It's
almost like it reminded me of Ron Chernow's Hamilton in that way, and
Right.
that sort of.
We've been saying Lin-Manuel Miranda needs to get this book.
That's right. All right, you've heard it here first. Okay, our 5 nonfiction winners, just to go over them quickly again. American Prison, a reporter's undercover journey into the business of punishment by Shane Bauer. Educated, a memoir by Tara Westover. Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David W. Blight. How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence by Michael Pollan. And Small Fry by Lisa Brennen Jobs. Okay, and now to talk a little bit about some of those that didn't make our list but that we truly loved. I'm going to start with Lauren.
Okay, one of my favorite books of the year was actually a debut short story collection called Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenya. They're satirical stories, so there's humor in them, but they're really all about violence in America, and of really two kinds: racially motivated violence and the violence of consumerism, which, obviously there are breaks between each story, but you really can't help but draw the connections between, obviously Friday Black is an inversion of Black Friday, so the consumerism as well as, racial violence. I think, we were all really taken with one of the stories called The Finkelstein Five, in which the narrator, so the backdrop of the story is a white man is on trial for murdering 5 black children with a chainsaw. And so it's really sort of hyperbolic violence, but the references are undeniable and really obvious, just to real life. And I won't give away what happens, but so that's in the backstory, and the narrator, who is a black man, is witnessing all this and has to deal with sort of his community grappling with the stakes of this trial. At the same time, he's going about his daily life, interviewing for jobs, and he dials up and down his capital B blackness on a scale of 1 to 10. So he'll say in this interview he's lower down on the scale. And when he's experiencing frustration and rage, he's much higher up on the scale. And it's just such a brilliant narrative device because, as a reader, you obviously don't have an image of him, but the image in your head, you can't help but change your image in your head when you get from number to number, and it just makes you sort of examine your own conscious or unconscious biases. And I just think as a narrative tool, it was such a powerful book for me. It's rough around the edges. It just it's not a perfect book, but I think that had to have been intentional. I think the subject matter is so messy and ugly that it's impossible to tie up with a neat bow, and I just thought that was That's just an
All
excellent.
right. We should say it's written by a 27-year-old
Yes, he's
debut
very-
author, and so that's understandable. One of the great pleasures of working with Tina Jordan is her enthusiasm. When she loves a book, she can also be extremely critical and judgmental too.
Yes, that's true.
But when she loves a book, she comes in raving about it. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about Rachel Slade?
So Rachel Slade's book, Into the Raging Sea, is the kind of narrative nonfiction that I love. It's what we in the journalism world call a tick-tock. It's a story that just goes moment by moment and takes you through a disaster. The disaster in this case is the sinking of a cargo ship during Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. And what Slade did to reconstruct this disaster moment by moment was she had the black box. She transcribed the black box. She had text messages and email messages, that members of the crew were sending to their friends and family. She had taped phone messages that they had left on people's phones and answering machines. It's almost as if it ushered in a new way to do this kind of nonfiction. You made me realize that the very idea of what's considered a primary source in nonfiction has changed in this day and age. When you read a book like Sebastian Junger's The Perfect Storm, obviously, a lot of that is imagined, that dialogue. But in this book, it's all real. And I just couldn't put it down.
All right, for a book that is kind of unreal in all respects, Emily, can you tell us about one of your runners-up? This was a book that we were talking about for months.
There were a lot of so many good books this year, but I wanted to talk about My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh because I don't think anyone here would disagree. It was the book that provoked the most conversation, the most heated conversation in the office. There was a lot of disagreement about what this book was trying to do and how well it succeeded. It was a very interesting experience reading this book. Otessa Moshfegh, I believe, has published, this is, I think, her third novel. All of her books, all three of them, are provocative. Her characters tend to have unattractive traits. She tends to foreground bodily functions and disgusting things. And this book was a very unpleasant read for me, I have to confess. And I found it very interesting because the prose struck me aesthetically as very, very beautiful and controlled and very deliberate. And what I think she was up to in this book, very quickly to sketch it, it's about an unnamed, young, beautiful female protagonist, a college graduate, whose parents have died and left her enough money to live on. Her ambition is sapped. She can't feel any sadness for her parents. She doesn't feel much of anything. She says, I feel nothing. Her parents weren't attractive people. She's not an attractive person. She has one friend whom she belittles and disparages behind her back, a boyfriend that sort of uses her and has really basically dumped her. Not a very attractive person. And she's decided that the way to address her sort of spiritual apathy is to sleep for a year. What would happen if she could just hibernate? And she finds a psychiatrist who is one of the great satirical psychiatrists in contemporary literature, a hilariously terrible psychiatrist who plies her with all kinds of medications and says things like, how are you feeling? Oh, well, I'm thinking. I think I'm overthinking. Oh, that's not good. That could lead to psychosis. You need some, and we'll hand her another prescription. And soon this woman is sleeping. Basically, through the novel, she sleeps. And that's a very interesting thing, right? It's very boring to think about reading a novel about a woman who's asleep. But all kinds of things happen when she's asleep. She wakes up every once in a while and discovers she's been to Saks Fifth Avenue and bought a fur coat. Or, she's eaten, 3 takeout containers of Chinese food or rented 3 movies. So a lot's going on while she's asleep. And not to drone on too long, I'm very struck by this book. I think it was a very original, really allegorical book about the kind of anesthetized state of our society and consumer culture, to sound very pretentious. And others may chime in and disagree, but it was an original and heady read for me.
All right. I want to give everyone a chance to talk up at least one favorite. Gal, can you tell us about Rise and Kill First?
Sure. So this is a book by Ronen Bergman, who's an Israeli journalist, the book is written in English. And he basically wanted to tell the entire story of Israel's use of kind of assassination as a method of kind of security. And he goes back to the birth of the state of Israel and tracks it all the way until today. And it's an interesting narrative because there's no kind of like the only through line is this method of deciding that you need to kind of take down your enemy before he's able to take you down. And you know, there is kind of a sense of justification about this as far as the Israeli state is concerned, because there's always a sense of kind of existential crisis that there are enemies who want to destroy us, and so we need to destroy them first. But what's interesting that happens as you kind of move through the narrative and get to today is that, you know, the ability to do these sorts of assassinations with like drones, you know, becomes so much easier that the kind of moral balance starts to tip. And you know, without kind of a too heavy a hand, Bergman kind of forces us to ask questions about, you know, when you can do that, when you can kill so easily, you know, what kind of, does it become ultimately counterproductive? Are you creating more terror?
I think one of the things that was so impressive about this book was the extent of the reporting and
incredible.
the number of people he spoke to. And my favorite line is when he calls up someone within the security forces or the intelligence in Israel, and the person basically says to him, "I hate you, and I hate whoever gave you my phone number," and sort of hangs up on him. So he's a tenacious reporter. John, tell us about, well, you had two here very quickly.
I'll go quickly, the lightning round. My fiction pick is Sigrid Nunez's The Friend, which won the National Book Award a couple of weeks ago, and which I revisited this week. I read a while back, and which I liked even more, kind of flipping through it the second time. It's the story of a woman who inherits a Great Dane from a friend of hers, a writer friend of hers who's committed suicide. And it's a very aphoristic book. It draws on a lot of old stories about other writers and their thoughts about living and friendship and writing. It's very explicitly about writing and the art of writing. It's also very explicitly about how to live and whether or not to live. And but it also just wears its profundity very lightly. And it's a fairly small book, and I would highly recommend probably get through it in a couple of hours.
A not small book.
The nonfiction book I have not finished and may never. It's about 8,000 pages long, and it's called and it's about the 15th century. All this sounds like the opposite of accessible, but it's I hate the word readable because you know, they're words, so it's like people call a beer drinkable, you know. I would hope it's a liquid, so it's, of course. But it does apply in this case because it's a book about Martin Luther and Erasmus and their two philosophies during the Renaissance and basically Christian humanism versus Christian evangelicalism, and how those two, they really started us down that forked path, and how Erasmus has kind of, the humanist part, has kind of fallen by the wayside, and Luther has been victorious. Michael Massing, the author, is a journalist, and it's just very well-chosen details. It reads just beautifully, and these you can kind of move through it chapter by chapter in a way that feels very doable, even though sitting on your desk it looks impossible.
All right, for those who want to do that, the title is?
Fatal Discord.
Okay.
By Michael Massing.
All right, Greg, you have two also on your list.
Yeah, one fiction, one non, and I'll also be quick. The novel that has really stuck with me in a way that I didn't initially anticipate was The Overstory by Richard Powers. Powers often writes about scientist characters, and he does again in this book. One of the main characters is a dendrologist who studies neural networks, and she discovers that trees communicate through the roots, and in fact, they really do. But it's a much bigger book than that, and over the course of the book, I talked about asymmetry, how I like structure and architecture in novels, and this is a book that is really about the trees themselves. There's a Vietnam vet character and a group of eco-terrorists who all come together with the scientists to try to save a stand of old trees in the Pacific Northwest. And it's a book that, in focusing on these trees, it takes you outside of the human time scale and into a bigger time scale than we're used to thinking about in our lives, certainly in fiction. And it's a book that during the California wildfires, I really couldn't get out of my mind in terms of how we treat the natural world, and how important it is to us that we're so focused on kind of our intimate personal lives, but there's this bigger thing beyond us that he really captures in a way that that I admired very much. And he's a beautiful writer, and it's a book that balances the human and the natural. And then in nonfiction, a book that has overlaps in some ways with Small Fry. It's a memoir, again, very intimate about a relationship with a mother, is the book Heavy by a guy named Kiese Lehman, who it's his first memoir, but I think his third book. He's done an essay collection and a novel. And it is, he grew up in Jackson, Mississippi with a mother who is very demanding. He's Black, growing up in Mississippi, and she was very demanding at trying to get him to succeed and study. She would give him extracurricular school assignments, papers, reading assignments. And she was demanding to the point of abuse. She would really beat him and then hide the beatings so that it wouldn't reflect badly on the family. And he did succeed, and he loves his mother a lot, but there's a lot, it's a very fraught relationship, and it takes place against this backdrop of racism and gambling and eating and sex, and there's just a lot going on there, and it's a very wide-eyed, clear-eyed, unflinching portrait that I just really recommend.
Pamela, what about you?
All right, I will end with two books that I think we sometimes don't recognize enough because they are pleasurable to read, both of them. One fiction, one nonfiction. The fiction is Tana French's The Witch Elm, which Tana French is just such an amazing writer, and this is a standalone novel, not one of her Dublin Murder Squad mysteries, but one that, it's hard to talk about it without revealing anything about the plot, but I will say this, when you do get to the end and you know who did what and why, it's a book that really is actually very much about our current moment in ways that are surprising and I found different for French. And also just a lot of fun to read. And then in that same vein, David Sedaris' Calypso. We were all such fans here of that book. Everyone knows David Sedaris, and he makes writing that is easy to read look easy to write, and I don't think that it is. I think that his writing, reflects a kind of constant fine-tuning of his craft. And this book, I thought, all his books are great, but I found this one to be especially moving and touching. I thought he went deeper and looked at some of the things that he touched, perhaps on a more lightly humorous level in previous work. He went back to and kind of examined and looked at more deeply. So those were two that I enjoyed reading. But with that, I think we should, we'll end our live portion of the book review podcast. Thank you to all of my panelists. It's such a pleasure to work with such talented and eloquent editors and writers here at the book review. Gal Beckerman, Emily Aiken, Tina Jordan, Greg Cowles, Lauren Christensen, and John Williams. Thank you all so much. And now we are going to cut off the recording and give you all the opportunity to ask us questions, whether it's about these 10 books or about our personal favorites or anything else that you've been dying to ask of the editors of the book review. So I think we have a microphone that's going to go around if you just want to raise your hand. Yes, here it comes.
I'm so impressed that you all have the time, apparently, to have read all of these books. I'm curious to know a little bit more how the selection process worked, whether you all nominated and then the rest of you read anything that you may not have read. Did you take a vote in September?
So the process has worked a little bit differently in different years. But what we did this year is this is actually only a small number of our staff. We have a full books desk at the New York Times. It's not just the editors of the book review, but we have other writers on our desk. We have the critics, obviously, and they will come out with their own 10 best lists. We have people who handle the news and the publishing industry. So we basically opened it up to that entire entire team. Some of the names you might be familiar with, their bylines, Concepcion de Leon, Olivia Garque, everyone really who, from the art director to the people who work in production, had a voice, because we were all working within the books, we were all reading, and so for beginning in January of this year, we kind of, to get down to nitty gritty, created a Google Doc, and everyone was able to put on the names of books that they thought should be contenders for the full year. And as we got closer to the end of the year, sort of towards the end of the summer, we then started to kind of knock off some books, add others, because by that time, by September, since we're often working 4 to 6 months ahead of time, we know what's coming out through the end of the year. And it is a kind of mad process in which we all, we start to gather copies of the books, we all try to read as much as we can, and we have a kind of informal, ongoing voting process until it gets down really to a very desperate moment where we have to narrow it down, and at that point it's rounds of voting, and at a certain point we brought it into the confines of the book review, because this is the book reviews list, and we are going to have all of our staff write up before the end of the year their sort of personal favorites from 2018, as well as our 3 critics who will have their own 10 best lists, I think next week, John? Next week. So that's Dwight Garner and Pearl Sagal and Jennifer Salai will have their own lists. But what we did was we took it into the book review, and then we had several meetings in which we gently discussed, always politely and in good spirit, and also had terrible fights, what would end up on the final list. And then ultimately it was then a brutal counting of numbers. Yes.
Thank you very much for your brilliant expose of that. I just had a broader question of the kind of trend. If you look, for example, at nonfiction, with the exception of American Prison, perhaps all of them are either autobiographical or biographical. And does this sort of portend a wider trend that we're seeing, or is it just 2018 exceptional? Thank you.
Go.
Well, there's also the David Blight, which is a big history book. I think Pamela said it earlier. With nonfiction in particular, it's really tough because there are so many different categories of nonfiction. I think this year we felt in particular that there were those 2 memoirs that really stood out for us. But and maybe that's what was unusual about this year. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't necessarily see them in that through that lens, because I think that the David Blight, while it is a biography, it is also a broader history of the abolitionism and slavery in that whole period of African American history and American
Michael
history.
Pollan, too, even
Michael
though it
Pollan
has
is
autobiography
science,
in it,
yeah.
I would also, when those lists come out next week, Jennifer Salai, our nonfiction critic, has 10 nonfiction books on her list. It's a very interesting list.
We're
so
not
look for
defensive. No, but I will say that, we did think twice about the fact that we did have 2 debut memoirs by women. And ultimately, it really is about the strength of the work itself. And so while we are trying to have some kind of balance and we are looking at all the books, ultimately what we come down to is the individual works. And that's something that runs throughout our entire selection process of what to review every week in the book review, which is that it really is about the book. And even though we thought, can we have these 2 books because they are so similar? Yes, because they're both outstanding and in other ways quite different books that really transcend that particular genre.
Well, Tara Westover's dad was definitely different than Steve Jobs.
Yes. Yes.
So my favorite book of the year was also Kiese Lehman's memoir, Heavy, and I just had sort of a question about your personal response to it and what you thought of the fact that he's addressing his mother in second person and sort of the ways in which that opens up the ways that these types of really hard stories about violence and sort of racial tensions and really dark things that are happening in this country right now, opening up to sort of deflect this idea of having to speak to a double audience and writing for your people, which is something he talks about a lot, and creates a lexicon within this idea, or sort of adjacent to code switching and using the sort of vocabularies that are.
There's a way that he seemingly bypasses the code switching there by speaking directly to his mother, and a sense that the audience is just eavesdropping in a very, it feels so intimate, this book. At the same time, that it pulls in this bigger. I said it's against this backdrop of racism and violence and sex and kind of all the other stuff, and it's this unflinching. He's not going to deny any of that stuff, and he opens the book by saying his mother wishes he would deny it, but she's also the one who taught him not to, and so he is navigating that throughout. So I mean, it is this extraordinary balancing act, and yeah, I mean, I agree with you that the decision to do it in the second person and to speak directly to his mother is a writerly strategy that he came up with that just it helped him achieve so much that he couldn't have were he speaking to a different audience, and it gives you the privilege of listening in on this internal discussion. Yeah.
To play podcast ambassador again, Kiese was also on recently on another episode of the podcast, and just extraordinarily eloquent about all those things, and also read a passage from the book in a really beautiful way, so like an extended passage. So I would suggest going back and listening to that.
Question over here.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Obviously, all your books deal with the human condition, but I was struck by the fact that none of them seem to deal with contemporary world affairs, the kind of things we read about in the New York Times every day. Do you think there's any, would it be a good idea to give a certain premium to certain subject matters when you make your choices?
You know, that's interesting because we have that conversation every year. There are books that are really important books about our current moment, books that have messages or arguments that we find compelling and important. But this isn't about the books that sort of make the, that reflect our current political moment. This is a list of books that we call the best books because they really are books that we do think will endure 5 or 10 years from now. There was so much news this year, and I think that one of the things that pleased us about this list was that it showed that even at a time where we're also distracted for good reason by what's going on in the headlines, that the reading that we found to be the most impactful did two things. One is that I think sometimes that these books in certain ways offer a deeper context for things that are going on now. So you could look at the Shane Bauer or the David Blight book, for example, and sort of see things there that explain how our country got to this point, certainly in terms of race, in terms of the relationship between our government and the private sector in this country. And also, I think, it was refreshing to us to see that so many new voices broke through all of that noise, that we had effectively, I think, 4 borderline 5 debut voices that authors that were on our list, that it was kind of remarkable that, again, that they could be heard amidst all of that. And I think that what we've been hearing from readers is that they are often reading in maybe 3 different ways. One is 100% on the moment. There's a reason why books like Fire and Fury and Fear, and for very different reasons, Michelle Obama's becoming kind of, people are drawn to reading those books. But at the same time, I think people are trying to read a little bit more deeply to get behind that. We saw that in the immediate aftermath, for example, of the election, that people turned to older books, in 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, trying to kind of contextualize where we are. And then the third thing I think that we're seeing is people just want to escape from that. That books offer a kind of way out of that, and not entirely to ignore where we are, but perhaps to remember that great art of all forms exists no matter what's going on in the world.
I'd add 2 quick things there. One is that I think it's harder for fiction to do that maybe in an obvious way, but I think the Tommy Orange book also obviously speaks very much to the current moment. And also, I think it's very difficult to write a great book, as Pamela described, the way we think of it, about current affairs. It happens for sure. But it often feels like just the latest reporting and very important, but it's not necessarily something that when the moment passes you will go back to. And
you need the
Right.
distance
And
to
it's one of the things that's the beauty of books is the gestation period that they take to actually like emerge into the world, is that there is baked into that a certain amount of thoughtfulness and distance that gives you something that you don't get from the newspaper stories every day.
And just another I think to speak to your question, you're pointing out some of the limitations of plot summary. I mean, our distillations of a book. Asymmetry is actually a book that's very anxious about this
Right.
idea of what a novel should address. And the second section is about a Muslim Iraqi American who's trapped in, arguably in currents that are of politics that are alive at this very moment. And so it's I think it's just hard in our 2 or 3 minute synopses to convey the kind of echoes and resonances that these books really do achieve, and that really is a part of their appeal to us, the reason they do speak to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we didn't mention about Tara Westover's Educated, for example, many people saw that as a kind of counterpoint to J.D. Vance's memoir, which was hugely read in the wake of the 2016 election, and both prior to that and subsequently, as a kind of how, who are we out there in America, outside of New York and away from the coasts. So I think, again, there too, you can find that kind of deeper reading into how we got to where we are now. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hello, thanks. Lists like this are a really big deal, I think, for authors and the industry at large. So I'm curious about whether or not all of you, collectively deal with any kind of campaigns by publishers or authors, and how you deal with that. And also, like, kind of a semicolon, whether or not those pressures influence your decisions in any way, and whether the sense of how powerful these lists are influences the decisions you make.
I'm going to give a really short and easy answer, which is that and it's really the truth, we don't pay attention to any of that at all. This is like, we've got enough going on, like with all these books and all of our different editors and writers on staff and our opinions, that process is really what matters here. So we just don't pay attention. In fact, we don't even know. I think people here on the desk can attest that yesterday I was like, wait, who are the publishers of these books?
That's true.
So publishers never like to hear that, but it is really true. It really is about the books.
But you mentioned the word campaigns, which is appropriate given that the Oscar campaign season is in full. This might be different for Pamela at her desk, but the many lovely relationships I have with publicists don't really involve that at all. Like, I don't think there's a sense of, this should be on your 10 best list.
I think they understand that it can be counterproductive too. Yeah. I mean, if that's
There is publicists promote their books. They're paid to. They do a good job of it, but they promote everything, and so we still have to have the ability to kind of filter that and say, yeah. And we're all eccentric, iconoclastic readers who say this one really speaks to me.
Speak for yourself. Very conventional. Very modest way.
We have someone from the industry over here. If I may identify you.
Sorry, Pamela. While you mentioned publishers, I just think it's important to note that you, while you said that you did not think about the publishers, I was looking at the books, and you picked 9 out of the 10 were published by big 5 publishers. Only 1 was published by an independent press. So I just wanted to know if you, I'm not going to ask you how that reflects the times.
Mm-hmm.
I think more I would like to know whether or not you think that reflects the state of the industry as a whole, or if that was just kind of, if you were as surprised by that as I am. And I just wanted also, I know you don't pick poetry for this list, but I would kind of like to know why.
Well, I'm going to let our poetry editor, Greg, answer that second question, but I will start off with the fact that I think that that's certainly true, and again, I only noticed that yesterday, that one book was published by Grove, which is a smaller independent press, but it's not always been the case, and it's different every year. We had one year where there were, I think, 4 or 5 books in translation, and some of them were from smaller publishers. Each year sort of strikes us as notable in some way, that because we are really thinking about the books themselves, we don't notice that pattern until we, have the final list in front of us. And again, this is a list that we really are considering the books in and of themselves, and not trying to pick a 10 grouping that it sort of somehow works as a whole. This is really comes down to the individual book. But I don't think that, I frankly don't see anything sort of alarming or disturbing about the fact that they came from big publishers, because I think that independent presses are thriving in a way that is wonderful to see, and a lot of our books do come from small and independent presses. It just so happens that this year, not as many made it to the final 10 list.
I will say, as the poetry editor, that poetry is part of this discussion. And Pamela earlier mentioned a Google Doc where we kind of put in our things. I had a poetry title on there very late in the game. But there's so much poetry, and we don't review a lot of it. And what we do so to find the one poetry book or the two poetry books that might be worthy of 10 best, to say, read these, to represent kind of everything that's out there. It's something that speaks to the moment, something that we're looking for in these best books. It's a high bar. You have a separate list of 10 best poetry books that will be coming out shortly, that our poetry columnist David Orr has compiled every year for the last several years, and has compiled again this year, that will be released soon. So we pay attention to it. This year was lobbying for a book, to make the list. It didn't happen.
I will say also, Greg is being very journalistically discreet, but I will reveal here in this intimate group that the issue after our 10 best is one that's dedicated to poetry. So you have that to look forward to. Yes.
I actually have three related questions. How many books come to you during a year? How many of them do you actually dive into, maybe not finish, and how do you decide which ones to dive into and read?
Wow. Okay, the first question is super easy and fast. I don't know. We don't have the time to count them because we're too busy trying to read them.
It's an insane number.
It's an insane number. We have
thousands
people
is
who have to
right.
come in and open up the mail twice a day, and for long periods of time. And then these guys we all get individual mail in addition, and it's like a thing that you dread doing, and you kind of leave to like a late afternoon.
There's a
once
whole
week.
genre of photos of after you've gone away on vacation and come back, and the mountain of books that are awaiting you.
Yes, I remember John once dared to take a 2-week vacation, and his
No, that was a 1-week vacation.
That was a 1-week vacation. I actually posted a photo online because
It
it
was
was
about
so
20 boxes of
terrifying.
books.
He could not get into his desk area because it was barricaded by boxes of books. I think the answer of how many we dive into depends on editor by editor, and it also depends on what you mean by dive into, because each of our editors gets a couple of these cartons, I think, every other week. It's I think a scarring and difficult experience when we hand them out, and the level at which you have to go in depends on the book. I don't know, Emily, do you want to talk about what it's like for you?
Well, I'm relatively new, and I have to say, I when I got to the book review, I thought I'll just be reading books all day. This is, and every once in a while I'll be exclaiming, "This is wonderful! Let's assign it." But in fact, it's really, really hard. I mean, you're always reading. You read at home, you read in the morning, and there's no method to answer your question. I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer. I mean, some books you know within 20 pages that this is not a book either. It's just not, you just know this isn't a book for our audience. But the vast majority are possibilities that you really have to spend time with. I don't know. Do you have a better answer? Someone else?
I mean, I think the short answer is nothing really, correct me if I'm wrong, gets thrown out without at least being looked
Yeah.
at. And I mean nothing. And the level of stuff that comes into us, sometimes you're like, this was published?
Yeah.
We look at everything. And then from then on, it really can vary. It can run the gamut from I can spend weeks looking at a book, deciding whether I want to cover it, or just a quick gut reaction.
Yes.
It's not always a perfect science.
There's
but-
also, I'm left out of this process a little bit, but there's also the sense of if, Philip Roth, were he still alive, if his new novel comes in, yes, you probably want to read it, but you know that we're going to cover it.
Right.
So you don't have to spend a lot of time.
Right.
So there are little shortcuts.
Our readers are depending on us to kind of weigh in. Even if we think something is terrible, if it's noteworthy for some reason, we probably want to have someone cover it in some way, and generally through a review. Anyone else want to talk about the terrible process?
One more?
Everyone's like dying to.
I mean, I think Emily hinted at this a little bit. Like, one of the important filters that we have when we're looking at books is thinking about, the resulting review and how interesting it will be for a reader to read a review of that book, especially when we're not talking about the Philip Roths, of the world. And that increasingly for me is like, as an editor, is the filter that I put on when I'm trying to figure out what to assign and what not to assign. Like, is this a book that people are going to want to read about? Or can I imagine like a really fascinating reviewer who will do an interesting job with this book, and the review itself will be just good reading?
I mean,
And
Gall has one of the hardest. We all have areas of expertise, and then everyone here is generalist too, and some people get more of a certain kind of book than others. And Gall gets the vast majority of our books that are on science and math, and I won't even go into the rest.
Math books.
Yes. And so, if you're the person who's doing the math books, like there are actually dozens and dozens, I think probably even hundreds of books about math published every year. Which are the few really that are
comprehensible
deserving.
to humans.
Yes.
But also the fun part is once
that
you
makes the job sound easy, actually.
but once you decide that you're going to cover it, then the fun part begins when you have to think of the best person to review it. And I think often the books that are the easiest decision to cover are the hardest to assign.
Yes. It's like the most important and most difficult part of the job is probably deciding what to cover, and the most fun part, in a way, and creative part of the job is deciding who to cover it. But there's another question over here. One more? One more.
And the mic
Sorry.
is over here. Sorry.
Thank you for this. I had a two-part question, I guess. One is, could you expand who you think your reader or audience is? And two, do you feel like your team reflects that audience in diversity and education, et cetera?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the second question, which is that the diversity in coverage is a huge goal and very important for us. And it takes so many forms too. It's about gender, it's about race, it's about ethnic origin, country of origin, language of origin. It's about the kind of book, both all across fiction and across nonfiction. And we're trying to cover all of that broadly. And also to do it in unexpected ways. And there are books that, as I think Lauren and John said earlier, we know we have to cover because people are expecting us to weigh in on. And I think the harder part, but also I think the part that, at least when I'm meeting with members of the staff here, I think is the more exciting part, is to find those new voices and unexpected voices and fresh voices. I think that when we have meetings about what books to assign, when I see the most excitement in our staff is when they come in and they say, like, well, this is out of a tiny press out of Minnesota, and I never heard of this publisher, and this author is, from Uganda, and we never get, rarely get books from Uganda, and that's when there's excitement, that it's something that we are going to help bring out into the world. And then the first part of your question, if we would repeat.
Who's your audience?
Who is our audience?
Well, I mean, some of them are here.
Here you are. Hopefully
Hello.
all of you. But we do, so, obviously our readers are the New York Times subscribers, but we don't want to settle with that because we're always trying to reach new audiences. I think we're trying to reach younger audiences, as anyone in the mainstream media is trying to do these days, and a more diverse audience, and those things are one and the same. Trying to reach a more global audience, and so with our coverage overall, we've been much more attentive. I think one of our critics, Parl Segal, I think in particular, does an excellent job in terms of really covering global literature in ways that I don't think that we've necessarily done as well as we could have in the past, and in her reviews really helps explain to the reader why this writer is important, what role this person has in their country of origin and perhaps in other areas of the world. So she's always really keeping an eye out for new works in translation.
Another preview, it's not a new work, but she'll have a review like that next week.
Okay, there you go.
A very global, important writer.
But it's one of the things reasons I find it most exciting to read her reviews, because they are of authors that I might not have heard of or have never read or not familiar with, and she explains, like, it gives us that broader context of where that person stands, both in their home country and in the sort of global world of letters. Does anyone want to add anything? No one wants to add anything. Well, hopefully our readers are you.
We're
All
right up at
right.
11 o'clock. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.